This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Lone Star Ranger by Zane Grey. This is the dedication to Captain John Hughes and his Texas Rangers. It may seem strange to you that out of all the stories I heard on the Rio Grande, I should choose as first that of Buck Duane, outlaw and gunman. But indeed, Ranger Coffey's story of the last of the Duanes has haunted me, and I have given full rein to imagination and have retold it in my own way. It deals with the old law, the old border days. Therefore it is better first. Soon, perchance, I shall have the pleasure of writing of the border of today, which in Joe Sitter's laconic speech, "Shore is most as bad and wild as ever." In the North and East there is a popular idea that the frontier of the West is a thing long past, and remembered now only in stories. As I think of this, I remember Ranger Sitter when he made that remark, while he grimly stroked an unhealed bullet wound. And I remember the giant Vaughn, that typical son of stalwart Texas, sitting there quietly with bandaged head, his thoughtful eye boding ill to the outlaw who had ambushed him. Only a few months have passed since then, when I had my memorable sojourn with you, and yet in that short time Russell and Moore have crossed the divide like rangers. Gentlemen, I have the honor to dedicate this book to you, and the hope that it shall fall to my lot to tell the world the truth about a strange, unique, and misunderstood body of men, the Texas Rangers, who made the great Lone Star State habitable, who never know peaceful rest and sleep, who are passing, who surely will not be forgotten and will some day come into their own. Signed, Zane Grey. End of dedication. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Lone Star Ranger by Zane Grey. Chapter 1. The Outlaw. So it was in him, then, an inherited fighting instinct, a driving intensity to kill. He was the last of the Duanes, that old fighting stock of Texas. But not the memory of his dead father, nor the pleading of his soft-voiced mother, nor the warning of this uncle who stood before him now, had brought to Buck Duane so much realization of the dark, passionate strain in his blood. It was the recurrence, 100-fold increased in power, of a strange emotion that for the last 3 years had arisen in him. "Yes, Cal Bain's in town, full of bad whiskey and hunting for you," repeated the elder man gravely. "It's the second time," muttered Duane as if to himself. "Son, you can't avoid a meeting. Leave town till Cal sobers up. He ain't got it in for you when he's not drinking." "But what's he want me for?" demanded Duane. "To insult me again? I won't stand that twice." "He's got a fever that's rampant in Texas these days, my boy. He wants gunplay. If he meets you, he'll try to kill you." Here it stirred in Duane again, that bursting gush of blood, like a wind of flame shaking all his inner being, and subsiding to leave him strangely chilled. "Kill me? What for?" he asked. "Lord knows there ain't any reason. But what's that to do with most of the shooting these days? Didn't 5 cowboys over to Everall's kill one another dead, all because they got to jerking at a quirt among themselves? And Cal has no reason to love you. His girl was sweet on you." "I quit when I found out she was his girl." I reckon she ain't quit. But never mind her or reasons. Cal's here, just drunk enough to be ugly. He's aching to kill somebody. He's one of them four-flush gunfighters. He'd like to be thought bad. There's a lot of wild cowboys who are ambitious for a reputation. They talk about how quick they are on the draw. The Ape Bland and Kingfisher and Hardin and all the big outlaws. They make threats about joining the gangs along the Rio Grande. They laugh at the sheriffs and brag about how they'd fix the rangers. Cal's sure not much for you to bother with if you only keep out of his way. You mean for me to run? Asked Duane in scorn. I reckon I wouldn't put it that way. Just avoid him. Buck, I'm not afraid Cal would get you if you met down there in town. You've your father's eye and his slick hand with a gun. What I'm most afraid of is that you'll kill Bain. Duane was silent, letting his uncle's earnest words sink in, trying to realize their significance. If Texas ever recovers from that fool war and kills off these outlaws, why, a young man will have a lookout, went on the uncle. You're 23 now, and a powerful sight of a fine fella, barring your temper. You've a chance in life. But if you go gunfighting, if you kill a man, you're ruined. Then you'll kill another. It'll be the same old story. And the Rangers would make you an outlaw. The Rangers mean law and order for Texas. This even break business doesn't work with them. If you resist arrest, they'll kill you. If you submit to arrest, then you go to jail and maybe you hang. I'd never hang, muttered Duane darkly. I reckon you wouldn't, replied the old man. You'd be like your father. He was ever ready to draw. Too ready. In times like these, with the Texas Rangers enforcing the law, your dad would have been driven to the river. And, son, I'm afraid you're a chip off the old block. Can't you hold in, keep your temper, run away from trouble? Because it'll only result in you getting the worst of it in the end. Your father was killed in a street fight, and it was told of him that he shot twice after a bullet had passed through his heart. Think of the terrible nature of a man to be able to do that. If you have any such blood in you, never give it a chance. What you say is all very well, Uncle, returned Duane. But the only way out for me is to run, and I won't do it. Cal Bain and his outfit have already made me look like a coward. He says I'm afraid to come out and face him. A man simply can't stand that in this country. Besides, Cal would shoot me in the back some day if I didn't face him. Well, then, what you going to do? Inquired the elder man. I haven't decided yet. No, but you're coming to it mighty fast. That damn spell is working in you. You're different today. I remember how you used to be moody and lose your temper and talk wild. Never was much afraid of you then. But now you're getting cool and quiet, and you think deep. And I don't like the light in your eye. It reminds me of your father. I wonder what Dad would say to me today if he were alive and here, said Duane. What do you think? What could you expect of a man who never wore a glove on his right hand for 20 years? Well, he'd hardly have said much. Dad never talked. But he would have done a lot, and I guess I'll go downtown and let Cal Bain find me. Then followed a long silence, during which Duane sat with downcast eyes, and the uncle appeared lost in sad thought of the future. Presently he turned to Duane with an expression that denoted resignation, and yet a spirit which showed wherein they were of the same blood. You've got a fast horse, the fastest I know of in this country. After you meet Bain, hurry back home. I'll have a saddlebag packed for you and the horse ready." With that he turned on his heel and went into the house, leaving Duane to revolve in his mind his singular speech. Buck wondered presently if he shared his uncle's opinion of the result of a meeting between himself and Bain. His thoughts were vague, but on the instant of final decision, when he had settled with himself that he would meet Bain, such a storm of passion assailed him that he felt as if he were being shaken with ague. Yet it was all internal, inside his breast, for his hand was like a rock, and, for all he could see, not a muscle about him quivered. He had no fear of Bain or of any other man, but a vague fear of himself, of this strange force in him, made him ponder and shake his head. It was as if he had not all to say in this matter. There appeared to have been in him a reluctance to let himself go, and some voice, some spirit from a distance, something he was not accountable for, had compelled him. That hour of Duane's life was like years of actual living, and in it he became a thoughtful man. He went into the house and buckled on his belt and gun. The gun was a Colt .45, 6-shot, and heavy, with an ivory handle. He had packed it on and off for 5 years. Before that it had been used by his father. There were a number of notches filed in the bulge of the ivory handle. This gun was the one his father had fired twice after being shot through the heart, and his hand had stiffened so tightly upon it in the death grip that his fingers had to be pried open. It had never been drawn upon any man since it had come into Duane's possession. But the cold, bright polish of the weapon showed how it had been used. Duane could draw it with inconceivable rapidity, and at 20 feet he could split a card pointing edgewise toward him. Duane wished to avoid meeting his mother. Fortunately, as he thought, she was away from home. He went out and down the path toward the gate. The air was full of the fragrance of blossoms and the melody of birds. Outside in the road a neighbor woman stood talking to a countryman in a wagon. They spoke to him, and he heard but did not reply. Then he began to stride down the road toward the town. Wellston was a small town, but important in that unsettled part of the great state because it was the trading center of several hundred miles of territory. On the main street there were perhaps 50 buildings, some brick, some frame, mostly adobe, and 1/3 of the lot, and by far the most prosperous, were saloons. From the road Duane turned into this street. It was a wide thoroughfare, lined by hitching rails and saddled horses and vehicles of various kinds. Duane's eye ranged down the street, taking in all at a glance, particularly persons moving leisurely up and down. Not a cowboy was in sight. Duane slackened his stride, and by the time he reached Sol White's place, which was the first saloon, he was walking slowly. Several people spoke to him and turned to look back after they had passed. He paused at the door of White's saloon, took a sharp survey of the interior, then stepped inside. The saloon was large and cool, full of men and noise and smoke. The noise ceased upon his entrance, and the silence ensuing presently broke to the clink of Mexican silver dollars at a monte table. Sol White, who was behind the bar, straightened up when he saw Duane. Then, without speaking, he bent over to rinse a glass. All eyes except those of the Mexican gamblers were turned upon Duane, and these glances were keen, speculative, questioning. These men knew Bain was looking for trouble. They probably had heard his boasts. But what did Duane intend to do? Several of the cowboys and ranchers present exchanged glances. Duane had been weighed by unerring Texas instinct, by men who all packed guns. The boy was the son of his father. Whereupon they greeted him and returned to their drinks and cards. Sol White stood with his big red hands out upon the bar. He was a tall, raw-boned Texan with a long mustache waxed to sharp points. "Howdy, Buck," was his greeting to Duane. He spoke carelessly and averted his dark gaze for an instant. "Howdy, Sol," replied Duane, slowly. "Say, Sol, I hear there's a gent in town looking for me bad." "Reckon there is, Buck," replied White. "He came in here about an hour ago. Shore he was some riled, and a roaring for gore. Told me confidential a certain party had given you a white silk scarf, and he was hell bent on wearing it home spotted red." "Anybody with him?" queried Duane. "Bird and Sam Outcalt, and a little cowpuncher I never seen before. They all was coaxin' Trim to leave town. But he's looked on the flowin' glass, Buck, and he's here for keeps." "Why doesn't Sheriff Oakes lock him up if he's that bad?" "Oakes went away with the rangers. There's been another raid at Flesher's ranch. The Kingfisher gang, likely, and so the town's shore wide open." Duane stalked outdoors and faced down the street. He walked the whole length of the long block, meeting many people. Farmers, ranchers, clerks, merchants, Mexicans, cowboys, and women. It was a singular fact that when he turned to retrace his steps the street was almost empty. He had not returned 100 yards on his way when the street was wholly deserted. A few heads protruded from doors and around corners. That main street of Wellston saw some such situation every few days. If it was an instinct for Texans to fight, it was also instinctive for them to sense with remarkable quickness the signs of a coming gunplay. Rumor could not fly so swiftly. In less than 10 minutes everybody who had been on the street or in the shops knew that Buck Duane had come forth to meet his enemy. Duane walked on. When he came to within 50 paces of a saloon, he swerved out into the middle of the street, stood there for a moment, then went ahead and back to the sidewalk. He passed on in this way the length of the block. Sol White was standing in the door of his saloon. "Buck, I'm a tipping you off," he said, quick and low-voiced. "Cal Bain's over at Everall's. If he's a hunting you bad, as he brags, he'll show there." Duane crossed the street and started down. Notwithstanding White's statement, Duane was wary and slow at every door. Nothing happened, and he traversed almost the whole length of the block without seeing a person. Everall's place was on the corner. Duane knew himself to be cold, steady. He was conscious of a strange fury that made him want to leap ahead. He seemed to long for this encounter more than anything he had ever wanted. But, vivid as were his sensations, he felt as if in a dream. Before he reached Everall's he heard loud voices, one of which was raised high. Then the short door swung outward, as if impelled by a vigorous hand. A bow-legged cowboy, wearing woolly chaps, burst out upon the sidewalk. At sight of Duane he seemed to bound into the air, and he uttered a savage roar. Duane stopped in his tracks at the outer edge of the sidewalk, perhaps a dozen rods from Everall's door. If Bain was drunk, he did not show it in his movement. He swaggered forward, rapidly closing up the gap. Red, sweaty, disheveled, and hatless, his face distorted and expressive of the most malignant intent, he was a wild and sinister figure. He had already killed a man, and this showed in his demeanor. His hands were extended before him, the right hand a little lower than the left. At every step he bellowed his rancor in speech mostly curses. Gradually he slowed his walk, then halted. A good 25 paces separated the men. "Won't nothing make you draw, you?" he shouted fiercely. "I'm waiting on you, Cal," replied Duane. Bain's right hand stiffened, moved. Duane threw his gun as a boy throws a ball underhand, a draw his father had taught him. He pulled twice, his shots almost as one. Bain's big Colt boomed while it was pointed downward, and he was falling. His bullets scattered dust and gravel at Duane's feet. He fell loosely, without contortion. In a flash all was reality for Duane. He went forward and held his gun ready for the slightest movement on the part of Bain. But Bain lay on his back, and all that moved were his breast and his eyes. How strangely the red had left his face, and also the distortion. The devil that had showed in Bain was gone. He was sober and conscious. He tried to speak, but failed. His eyes expressed something pitifully human. They changed, rolled, set blankly. Duane drew a deep breath and sheathed his gun. He felt calm and cool, glad the fray was over. One violent expression burst from him. The fool! When he looked up, there were men around him. Plumb center, said one. Another, a cowboy who evidently had just left the gaming table, leaned down and pulled open Bain's shirt. He had the ace of spades in his hand. He laid it on Bain's breast, and the black figure on the card covered the 2 bullet holes just over Bain's heart. Duane wheeled and hurried away. He heard another man say, "Reckon Cal got what he deserved. Buck Duane's first gunplay. Like father, like son." End of chapter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Lone Star Ranger by Zane Grey, Chapter 2. A thought kept repeating itself to Duane, and it was that he might have spared himself concern through his imagining how awful it would be to kill a man. He had no such feeling now. He had rid the community of a drunken, bragging, quarrelsome cowboy. When he came to the gate of his home and saw his uncle there with a mettlesome horse, saddled, with canteen, rope, and bags all in place, a subtle shock pervaded his spirit. It had slipped his mind, the consequence of his act. But sight of the horse and the look of his uncle recalled the fact that he must now become a fugitive. An unreasonable anger took hold of him. "The damn fool!" he exclaimed hotly. "Meeting Bain wasn't much, Uncle Jim. He dusted my boots, that's all. And for that I've got to go on the dodge." "Son, you killed him, then?" asked the uncle huskily. "Yes, I stood over him, watched him die. I did as I would have been done by." "I knew it. Long ago I saw it coming. But now we can't stop to cry over spilt blood. You've got to leave town in this part of the country." "Mother!" exclaimed Duane. "She's away from home. You can't wait. I'll break it to her. What she's always feared." Suddenly Duane sat down and covered his face with his hands. "My God! Uncle, what have I done?" His broad shoulders shook. "Listen, son, and remember what I say," replied the elder man earnestly. "Don't ever forget. You're not to blame. I'm glad to see you take it this way, because maybe you'll never grow hard and callous. You're not to blame. This is Texas. You're your father's son. These are wild times. The law, as the rangers are laying it down now, can't change life all in a minute. Even your mother, who's a good, true woman, has had her share in making you what you are this moment. For she was one of the pioneers, the fighting pioneers of this state. Those years of wild times before you was born developed in her instinct to fight, to save her life, her children, and that instinct is cropped out in you. It will be many years before it dies out of the boys born in Texas." "I'm a murderer," said Duane, shuddering. "No, son, you're not, and you never will be. but you've got to be an outlaw till time makes it safe for you to come home." "An outlaw?" "I said it. If we had money and influence we'd risk a trial. But we've neither. And I reckon the scaffold or jail is no place for Buckley Duane. Strike for the wild country. And wherever you go, in whatever you do, be a man. Live honestly if that's possible. If it isn't, be as honest as you can. If you have to herd with outlaws, try not to become bad. There are outlaws who are not all bad. Many who have been driven to the river by such a deal as this you had. When you get among these men, avoid brawls. Don't drink. Don't gamble. I needn't tell you what to do if it comes to gunplay, as likely it will. You can't come home. When this thing is lived down, if that time ever comes, I'll get word into the unsettled country. It'll reach you some day. That's all. Remember, be a man. Goodbye." Duane, with blurred sight and contracting throat, gripped his uncle's hand and bade him a wordless farewell. Then he leaped aside the black and rode out of town. As swiftly as was consistent with a care for his steed, Duane put a distance of 15 or 18 miles behind him. With that he slowed up, and the matter of riding did not require all his faculties. He passed several ranches and was seen by men. This did not suit him, and he took an old trail across country. It was a flat region with a poor growth of mesquite and prickly pear cactus. Occasionally he caught a glimpse of low hills in the distance. He had hunted often in that section and knew where to find grass and water. When he reached this higher ground he did not, however, halt at the first favorable camping spot, but went on and on. Once he came out upon the brow of a hill and saw a considerable stretch of country beneath him. It had the gray sameness characterizing all that he had traversed. He seemed to want to see wide spaces, to get a glimpse of the great wilderness lying somewhere beyond to the southwest. It was sunset when he decided to camp at a likely spot he came across. He led the horse to water, and then began searching through the shallow valley for a suitable place to camp. He passed by old campsites that he well remembered. These, however, did not strike his fancy this time, and the significance of the change in him did not occur at the moment. At last he found a secluded spot, under cover of thick mesquites and oaks, at a goodly distance from the old trail. He took saddle and pack off the horse. He looked among his effects for a hobble, and finding that his uncle had failed to put one in, he suddenly remembered that he seldom used a hobble, and never on this horse. He cut a few feet off the end of his lasso and used that. The horse, unused to such hampering of his free movements, had to be driven out upon the grass. Duane made a small fire, prepared and ate his supper. This done, ending the work of that day, he sat down and filled his pipe. Twilight had waned into dusk. A few wan stars had just begun to show and brighten. Above the low, continuous hum of insects sounded the evening carol of robins. Presently the birds ceased their singing, and then the quiet was more noticeable. When night set in, and the place seemed all the more isolated and lonely for that, Duane had a sense of relief. It dawned upon him all at once that he was nervous, watchful, sleepless. The fact caused him surprise, and he began to think back, to take note of his late actions and their motives. The change one day had wrought amazed him. He who had always been free, easy, happy, especially when out alone in the open, had become in a few short hours bound, serious, preoccupied. The silence that had once been sweet now meant nothing to him except a medium whereby he might the better hear the sounds of pursuit. The loneliness, the night, the wild, that had always been beautiful to him, now only conveyed a sense of safety for the present. He watched, he listened, he He thought. He felt tired, yet he had no inclination to rest. He intended to be off by dawn, heading toward the southwest. Had he a destination? It was vague as his knowledge of that great waste of mesquite and rock bordering the Rio Grande. Somewhere out there was a refuge, for he was a fugitive from justice, an outlaw. This being an outlaw then meant eternal vigilance, no home, no rest, no sleep, no content, no life worth the living. He must be a lone wolf, or he must herd among men obnoxious to him. If he worked for an honest living, he must still hide his identity and take risks of detection. If he did not work on some distant outlying ranch, how was he to live? The idea of stealing was repugnant to him. The future seemed gray and somber enough, and he was 23 years old. Why had this hard life been imposed upon him? The bitter question seemed to start a strange iciness that stole along his veins. What was wrong with him? He stirred the few sticks of mesquite into a last flickering blaze. He was cold, and for some reason he wanted some light. The black circle of darkness weighed down upon him, closed in around him. Suddenly he sat bolt upright, and then froze in that position. He had heard a step. It was behind him. No, on the side. Someone was there. He forced his hand down to his gun, and the touch of cold steel was another icy shock. Then he waited. But all was silent. Silent as only a wilderness arroyo can be, with its low murmuring of wind in the mesquite. Had he heard a step? He began to breathe again. But what was the matter with the light of his campfire? It had taken on a strange green luster and seemed to be waving off into the outer shadows. Duane heard no step, saw no movement. Nevertheless, there was another present at that campfire vigil. Duane saw him. He lay there in the middle of the green brightness, prostrate, motionless, dying. Cal Bain. His features were wonderfully distinct, clearer than any cameo, more sharply outlined than those of any picture. It was a hard face softening at the threshold of eternity. The red tan of sun, the coarse signs of drunkenness, the ferocity and hate so characteristic of Bain, were no longer there. This face represented a different Bain, showed all that was human in him, fading as swiftly as it blanched white. The lips wanted to speak, but had not the power. The eyes held an agony of thought. They revealed what might have been possible for this man if he lived, that he saw his mistake too late. Then they rolled, set blankly, and closed in death. That haunting visitation left Duane sitting there in a cold sweat, a remorse gnawing at his vitals, realizing the curse that was on him. He divined that never would he be able to keep off that phantom. He remembered how his father had been eternally pursued by the furies of accusing guilt, how he had never been able to forget in work or in sleep those men he had killed. The hour was late when Duane's mind let him sleep, and then dreams troubled him. In the morning he bestirred himself so early that in the gray gloom he had difficulty in finding his horse. Day had just broken when he struck the old trail again. He rode hard all morning and halted in a shady spot to rest and graze his horse. In the afternoon he took to the trail at an easy trot. The country grew wilder. Bald, rugged mountains broke the level of the monotonous horizon. About 3 in the afternoon he came to a little river which marked the boundary line of his hunting territory. The decision he made to travel upstream for a while was owing to 2 facts. The river was high with quicksand bars on each side, and he felt reluctant to cross into that region where his presence alone meant that he was a marked man. The bottomlands through which the river wound to the southwest were more inviting than the barrens he had traversed. The rest of that day he rode leisurely upstream. At sunset he penetrated the brakes of willow and cottonwood to spend the night. It seemed to him that in this lonely cover he would feel easy and content. But he did not. Every feeling, every imagining he had experienced the previous night returned somewhat more vividly and accentuated by newer ones of the same intensity and color. In this kind of travel and camping he spent 3 more days, during which he crossed a number of trails, and one road where cattle, stolen cattle probably, had recently passed. Thus time exhausted his supply of food, except salt, pepper, coffee, and sugar, of which he had a quantity. There were deer in the brakes, but as he could not get close enough to kill them with a revolver, he had to satisfy himself with a rabbit. He knew he might as well content himself with the hard fare that assuredly would be his lot. Somewhere up this river there was a village called Huntsville. It was distant about 100 miles from Wellston, and had a reputation throughout southwestern Texas. He had never been there. The fact was, this reputation was such that honest travelers gave the town a wide berth. Duane had considerable money for him in his possession, and he concluded to visit Huntsville, if he could find it, and buy a stock of provisions. The following day, toward evening, he happened upon a road which he believed might lead to the village. There were a good many fresh horse tracks in the sand, and these made him thoughtful. Nevertheless, he followed the road, proceeding cautiously. He had not gone very far when the sound of rapid hoof-beats caught his ears. They came from his rear. In the darkening twilight he could not see any great distance back along the road. Voices, however, warned him that these riders, whoever they were, had approached closer than he liked. To go farther down the road was not to be thought of, so he turned a little way in among the mesquites and halted, hoping to escape being seen or heard. As he was now a fugitive, it seemed every man was his enemy and pursuer. The horsemen were fast approaching. Presently they were abreast of Duane's position, so near that he could hear the creak of saddles, the clink of spurs. "Shore he crossed the river below," said one man. "I reckon you're right, Bill. He slipped us," replied another. Rangers, or a posse of ranchers in pursuit of a fugitive. The knowledge gave Duane a strange thrill. Certainly they could not have been hunting him, but the feeling their proximity gave him was identical to what it would have been had he been this particular hunted man. He held his breath. He clenched his teeth. He pressed a quieting hand upon his horse. Suddenly he became aware that these horsemen had halted. They were whispering. He could just make out a dark group closely massed. What had made them halt so suspiciously? "You're wrong, Bill," said a man in a low but distinct voice. "The idea of hearing a horse heave. You're wuss than a ranger, and you're hell-bent on killing that rustler. Now I say let's go home and eat." "Well, I'll just take a look at the sand," replied the man called Bill. Duane heard the clink of spurs on steel stirrup and the thud of boots on the ground. There followed a short silence which was broken by a sharply breathed exclamation. Duane waited for no more. They had found his trail. He spurred his horse straight into the brush. At the second crashing bound there came yells from the road and then shots. Duane heard the hiss of a bullet close by his ear, and as it struck a branch it made a peculiar singing sound. These shots and the proximity of that lead missile roused in Duane a quick, hot resentment which mounted into a passion almost ungovernable. He must escape, yet it seemed that he did not care whether he did or not. Something grim kept urging him to halt and return the fire of these men. After running a couple of 100 yards he raised himself from over the pommel, where he had bent to avoid the stinging branches, and tried to guide his horse. In the dark shadows under mesquites and cottonwoods he was hard put to it to find open passage. However, he succeeded so well and made such little noise that gradually he drew away from his pursuers. The sound of their horses crashing through the thickets died away. Duane reined in and listened. He had distanced them. Probably they would go into camp until daylight, then follow his tracks. He started on again, walking his horse, and peered sharply at the ground, so that he might take advantage of the first trail he crossed. It seemed a long while until he came upon one. He followed it until a late hour, when, striking the willow brakes again and hence the neighborhood of the river, he picketed his horse and lay down to rest. But he did not sleep. His mind bitterly revolved the fate that had come upon him. He made efforts to think of other things, but in vain. Every moment he expected the chill, the sense of loneliness that yet was ominous of a strange visitation, the peculiarly imagined lights and shades of the night, these things that presaged the coming of Cal Bane. Doggedly Duane fought against the insidious phantom. He kept telling himself that it was just imagination, that it would wear off in time. Still, in his heart, he did not believe what he hoped. But he would not give up. He would not accept the ghost of his victim as a reality. Gray dawn found him in the saddle again, headed for the river. Half an hour of riding brought him to the dense chaparral and willow thickets. These he threaded to come at length to the ford. It was a gravel bottom, and therefore an uneasy crossing. Once upon the opposite shore, he reined in his horse and looked darkly back. This action marked his acknowledgment of his situation. He had voluntarily sought the refuge of the outlaws. He was beyond the pale. A bitter and passionate curse passed his lips as he spurred his horse into the brakes on that alien shore. He rode perhaps 20 miles, not sparing his horse nor caring whether or not he left a plain trail. "Let them hunt me," he muttered. When the heat of the day began to be oppressive, and hunger and thirst made themselves manifest, Duane began to look about him for a place to halt for the noon hours. The trail led into a road which was hard packed and smooth from the tracks of cattle. He doubted not that he had come across one of the roads used by border raiders. He headed into it, and had scarcely traveled a mile when, turning a curve, he came point blank upon a single horseman riding toward him. Both riders wheeled their mounts sharply and were ready to run and shoot back. Not more than 100 paces separated them. They stood then for a moment watching each other. "Mornin', stranger," called the man, dropping his hand from his hip. "Howdy," replied Duane shortly. They rode toward each other, closing half the gap. Then they halted again. "I seen you ain't no ranger," called the rider, "and sure I ain't none." He laughed loudly as if he had made a joke. "How'd you know I wasn't a ranger?" asked Duane curiously. Somehow he had instantly divined that his horseman was no officer, or even a rancher trailing stolen stock. "Wal," said the fellow, starting his horse forward at a walk, "a ranger'd never get ready to run the other way from one man." He laughed again. He was small and wiry, slouchy of attire, and armed to the teeth, and he bestrode a fine bay horse. He had quick, dancing brown eyes, at once frank and bold, and a coarse, bronzed face. Evidently he was a good-natured ruffian. Duane acknowledged the truth of the assertion, and turned over in his mind how shrewdly the fellow had guessed him to be a hunted man. "My name's Luke Stevens, and I hail from the river. Who are you?" said this stranger. Duane was silent. "I reckon you're Buck Duane," went on Stevens. "I heerd you were a damn bad man with a gun." This time Duane laughed, not at the doubtful compliment, but at the idea that the first outlaw he met should know him. Here was proof of how swiftly facts about gunplay traveled on the Texas border. "Wal, Buck," said Stevens, in a friendly manner, "I ain't presumin' on your time or company. I see you're headin' for the river. But will you stop long enough to stake a feller to a bite of grub?"
I'm out of grub and pretty hungry myself, admitted Duane. Been pushin' your hoss, I see. Well, I reckon you'd better stock up before you hit that stretch of country. He made a wide sweep of his right arm, indicating the southwest, and there was that in his action which seemed significant of a vast and barren region. "Stock up?" queried Duane, thoughtfully. "Shore. A feller has just got to eat. I can rustle along without whiskey, but not without grub. That's what makes it so embarrassin' travelin' these parts dodgin' your shadow. Now I'm on my way to Mercer. It's a little two-bit town up the river a ways. I'm goin' to pack out some grub." Stevens's tone was inviting. Evidently he would welcome Duane's companionship, but he did not openly say so. Duane kept silence, however, and then Stevens went on, "Stranger, in this here country two's a crowd. It's safer. I never was much on this lone wolf dodgin', though I've done it of necessity. It takes a damn good man to travel alone any length of time. Why, I've been that sick I was just achin' for some ranger to come along and plug me. Give me a pardner any day. Now, maybe you're not that kind of a feller, and I'm sure not presumin' to ask, but I just declares myself sufficient." "You mean you'd like me to go with you?" asked Duane. Stevens grinned. "Wal, I should smile. I'd be particularly proud to be braced with a man of your reputation." "See here, my good fellow, that's all nonsense," declared Duane in some haste. "Shore, I think modesty becomin' to a youngster," replied Stevens. "I hate a brag, and I no use for these four-flush cowboys that are always lookin' for trouble and talkin' gunplay. Buck, I don't know much about you, but every man who's lived along the Texas border remembers a lot about your dad. It was expected of you, I reckon, and much of your rep was established before you thronged your gun. I just heerd that you was lightnin' on the draw, and when you cut loose with a gun, why, the figure on the ace of spades would cover your cluster of bullet holes. That's the word that's gone down the border. It's the kind of reputation most sure to fly far and swift ahead of a man in this country. And the safest, too. I'll gamble on that. It's the land of the draw. I see now you're only a boy, though you're sure a strappin' husky one. Now, Buck, I'm not a spring chicken, and I've been long on the dodge. Maybe a little of my society won't hurt you none. You'll need to learn the country." There was something sincere and likable about this outlaw. "I dare say you're right," replied Duane quietly. "And I'll go to Mercer with you." Next moment he was riding down the road with Stevens. Duane had never been much of a talker, and now he found speech difficult. But his companion did not seem to mind that. He was a jocose, voluble fellow, probably glad now to hear the sound of his own voice. Duane listened, and sometimes he thought with a pang of the distinction of name and heritage of blood his father had left to him. End of chapter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Lone Star Ranger by Zane Grey, Chapter 3. Late that day, a couple of hours before sunset, Duane and Stevens, having rested their horses in the shade of some mesquites near the town of Mercer, saddled up and prepared to move. "Buck, as we're looking for grub and not trouble, I reckon you'd better hang up out here," Stevens was saying as he mounted. "You see, towns and sheriffs and rangers are always looking for new fellers gone bad. They sort of forget most of the old boys, except those as are plumb bad. Now, nobody in Mercer will take notice of me. Reckon there's been 1,000 men run into the river country to become outlaws since yours truly. You just wait here and be ready to ride hard. Maybe my besetting sin will go operating in spite of my good intentions, in which case there'll be. His pause was significant. He grinned, and his brown eyes danced with a kind of wild humor. "Stevens, have you got any money?" asked Duane. "Money!" exclaimed Luke blankly. "Say, I haven't owned a 2-bit piece since, for some time." "I'll furnish money for grub," returned Duane, "and for whiskey, too, provided you hurry back here without making trouble." "Shore you're a downright good pard," declared Stevens in admiration as he took the money. "I give you my word, Buck, and I'm here to say I never broke it yet. Lay low and look for me back quick." With that he spurred his horse and rode out of the mesquites toward the town. At that distance, about a quarter of a mile, Mercer appeared to be a cluster of low adobe houses set in a grove of cottonwoods. Pastures of alfalfa were dotted by horses and cattle. Duane saw a sheepherder driving in a meager flock. Presently Stevens rode out of sight into the town. Duane waited, hoping the outlaw would make good his word. Probably not a quarter of an hour had elapsed when Duane heard the clear reports of a Winchester rifle, the clatter of rapid hoofbeats, and yells unmistakably the kind to mean danger for a man like Stevens. Duane mounted and rode to the edge of the mesquites. He saw a cloud of dust down the road and a bay horse running fast. Stevens apparently had not been wounded by any of the shots, for he had a steady seat in his saddle, and his riding, even at that moment, struck Duane as admirable. He carried a large pack over the pommel, and he kept looking back. The shots had ceased, but the yells increased. Duane saw several men running and waving their arms. Then he spurred his horse and got into a swift stride, so Stevens would not pass him. Presently the outlaw caught up with him. Stevens was grinning, and there was now no fun in the dancing eyes. It was a devil that danced in them. His face seemed a shade paler. "Was just coming out of the store," yelled Stevens. "Ran plumb into a rancher who knowed me. He opened up with a rifle. Think they'll chase us." They covered several miles before there were any signs of pursuit, and when horsemen did move into sight out of the cottonwoods, Duane and his companions steadily drew farther away. "No hosses in that bunch to worry us," called out Stevens. Duane had the same conviction, and he did not look back again. He rode somewhat to the fore, and was constantly aware of the rapid thudding of hoofs behind, as Stevens kept close to him. At sunset they reached the willow brakes and the river. Duane's horse was winded and lashed with sweat and lather. It was not until the crossing had been accomplished that Duane halted to rest his animal. Stevens was riding up the low, sandy bank. He reeled in the saddle. With an exclamation of surprise, Duane leaped off and ran to the outlaw's side. Stevens was pale, and his face bore beads of sweat. The whole front of his shirt was soaked with blood. "You're shot!" cried Duane. "Wal, who in hell says I wasn't? Would you mind giving me a lift on this here pack?" Duane lifted the heavy pack down and then helped Stevens to dismount. The outlaw had a bloody foam on his lips, and he was spitting blood. "Oh, why didn't you say so?" cried Duane. "I never thought. You seemed all right." "Wal, Luke Stevens may be as gabby as an old woman, but sometimes he doesn't say anythin'. It wouldn't have done no good." Duane bade him sit down, removed his shirt, and washed the blood from his breast and back. Stevens had been shot in the breast, fairly low down, and the bullet had gone clear through him. His ride, holding himself and that heavy pack in the saddle, had been a feat little short of marvelous. Duane did not see how it had been possible, and he felt no hope for the outlaw.
but he plugged the wounds and bound them tightly. "Feller's name was Brown," Stevens said. "Me and him fell out over a hoss I stole from him over in Huntsville. We had a shootin' scrape then. Wal, as I was straddlin' my hoss back there in Mercer, I seen this Brown, and seen him before he seen me. Could have killed him, too, but I wasn't breakin' my word to you. I kind of hoped he wouldn't spot me. But he did, and first shot he got me here. What do you think of this hole?" "It's pretty bad," replied Duane, and he could not look the cheerful outlaw in the eyes. "I reckon it is. Well, I've had some bad wounds I lived over. Guess maybe I can stand this one. Now, Buck, get me some place in the breaks. Leave me some grub and water at my hand, and then you clear out." "Leave you here alone?" asked Duane, sharply. "Shore. You see, I can't keep up with you. Brown and his friends will follow us across the river a ways. You've got to think of number one in this game." "What would you do in my case?" asked Duane, curiously. "Wal, I reckon I'd clear out and save my hide," replied Stevens. Duane felt inclined to doubt the outlaw's assertion. For his own part, he decided his conduct without further speech. First he watered the horses, filled canteens and water bag, and then tied the pack upon his own horse. That done, he lifted Stevens upon his horse, and, holding him in the saddle, turned into the breaks, being careful to pick out hard or grassy ground that left little signs of tracks. Just about dark he ran across a trail that Stevens said was a good one to take into the wild country. "Reckon we better keep right on in the dark till I drop," concluded Stevens with a laugh. All that night Duane, gloomy and thoughtful, attentive to the wounded outlaw, walked the trail and never halted till daybreak. He was tired then and very hungry. Stevens seemed in bad shape, although he was still spirited and cheerful. Duane made camp. The outlaw refused food, but asked for both whiskey and water. Then he stretched out. "Buck, will you take off my boots?" he asked, with a faint smile on his pallid face. Duane removed them, wondering if the outlaw had the thought that he did not want to die with his boots on. Stevens seemed to read his mind. "Buck, my old daddy used to say that I was born to be hanged. But I wasn't, and dying with your boots on is the next wust way to croak." "You've a chance to get over this," said Duane. "Shore, but I want to be correct about the boots. And say, pard, if I do go over, just you remember that I was appreciatin' of your kindness." Then he closed his eyes and seemed to sleep. Duane could not find water for the horses, but there was an abundance of dew-wet grass upon which he hobbled them. After that was done he prepared himself a much-needed meal. The sun was getting warm when he lay down to sleep, and when he awoke it was sinking in the west. Stevens was still alive, for he breathed heavily. The horses were in sight. All was quiet except the hum of insects in the brush. Duane listened a while, then rose and went for the horses. When he returned with them, he found Stevens awake, bright-eyed, cheerful as usual, and apparently stronger. "Wal, Buck, I'm still with you, and good for another night's ride," he said. "Guess about all I need now is a big pull on that bottle. Help me, will you? There. That was bully. I ain't swallowing my blood this evening. Maybe I bled all there was in me." While Duane got a hurried meal for himself, packed up the little outfit, and saddled the horses, Stevens kept on talking. He seemed to be in a hurry to tell Duane all about the country. Another night ride would put them beyond fear of pursuit, within striking distance of the Rio Grande and the hiding places of the outlaws. When it came time for mounting the horses, Stevens said, "Reckon you can pull on my boots once more." In spite of the laugh accompanying the words, Duane detected a subtle change in the outlaw's spirit. On this night travel was facilitated by the fact that the trail was broad enough for 2 horses abreast, enabling Duane to ride while upholding Stevens in the saddle. The difficulty most persistent was in keeping the horses in a walk. They were used to a trot, and that kind of gait would not do for Stevens. The red died out of the west. A pale afterglow prevailed for a while. Darkness set in. Then the broad expanse of blue darkened and the stars brightened. After a while Stevens ceased talking and drooped in his saddle. Duane kept the horses going, however, and the slow hours wore away. Duane thought the quiet night would never break to dawn, that there was no end to the melancholy brooding plain, but at length a grayness blotted out the stars and mantled the level of mesquite and cactus. Dawn caught the fugitives at a green camping site on the bank of a rocky little stream. Stevens fell a dead weight into Duane's arms, and one look at the haggard face showed Duane that the outlaw had taken his last ride. He knew it, too. Yet that cheerfulness prevailed. "Buck, my feet are orful tired packing them heavy boots," he said, and seemed immensely relieved when Duane had removed them. This matter of the outlaw's boots was strange, Duane thought. He made Stevens as comfortable as possible, then attended to his own needs. And the outlaw took up the thread of his conversation where he had left off the night before. "This trail splits up a ways from here, and every branch of it leads to a hole where you'll find men. A few maybe like yourself, some like me, and gangs of no good hoss thieves, rustlers and such. It's easy living, Buck. I reckon, though, that you'll not find it easy. You'll never mix in. You'll be a lone wolf. I've seen that right off. Well, if a man can stand the loneliness, and if he's quick on the draw, maybe lone wolfing it is the best. Sure, I don't know, but these fellers in here will be suspicious of a man who goes it alone. If they get a chance, they'll kill you." Stevens asked for water several times. He had forgotten, or he did not want the whiskey. His voice grew perceptibly weaker. "Be quiet," said Duane. "Talking uses up your strength." "Aw, I'll talk till I'm done," he replied doggedly. "See here, pard, you can gamble on what I'm telling you, and it'll be useful. From this camp you'll meet men right along. And none of them will be honest men. All the same, some are better than others. I've lived along the river for 12 years. There's 3 big gangs of outlaws. King Fisher, you know him, I reckon, for he's half the time living among respectable folks. King is a pretty good feller. It'll do to tie up with him and his gang. Now there's Cheseldine, who hangs out in the rim rock way up the river. He's an outlaw chief. I never seen him, though I stayed once right in his camp. Late years he's got rich and keeps back pretty well hid. But Bland, I knowed Bland for years, and I haven't any use for him. Bland has the biggest gang. You ain't likely to miss striking his place sometime or other. He's got a regular town, I might say. Sure, there's some gambling and gunfighting going on at Bland's camp all the time. Bland has killed some 20 men, and that's not counting greasers." Here Stevens took another drink and then rested for a while. "You ain't likely to get on with Bland," he resumed presently. "You're too strapping big and good-looking to please the chief, for he's got women in his camp. Then he'd be jealous of your possibilities with a gun. Sure, I reckon he'd be careful, though. Bland's no fool, and he loves his hide. I reckon any of the other gangs would be better for you when you ain't going it alone." Apparently that exhausted the fund of information and advice Stevens had been eager to impart. He lapsed into silence and lay with closed eyes. Meanwhile the sun rose warm, the breeze waved the mesquites, the birds came down to splash in the shallow stream. Duane dozed in a comfortable seat. By and by something roused him. Stevens was once more talking, but with a changed tone. "Feller's name was Brown," he rambled. "We fell out over a hoss I stole from him in Huntsville. He stole it fuss. Brown's one of them sneaks. Afraid of the open. He steals and pretends to be honest. Say, Buck, maybe you'll meet Brown some day. You and me are pards now." "I'll remember if I ever meet him," said Duane. That seemed to satisfy the outlaw. Presently he tried to lift his head, but had not the strength. A strange shade was creeping across the bronzed, rough face. "My feet are pretty heavy. Sure you got my boots off?" Duane held them up, but was not certain that Stevens could see them. The outlaw closed his eyes again and muttered incoherently. Then he fell asleep. Duane believed that sleep was final. The day passed, with Duane watching and waiting. Toward sundown Stevens awoke, and his eyes seemed clearer. Duane went to get some fresh water, thinking his comrade would surely want some. When he returned, Stevens made no sign that he wanted anything. There was something bright about him, and suddenly Duane realized what it meant. "Pard, you stuck to me," the outlaw whispered. Duane caught a hint of gladness in the voice. He traced a faint surprise in the haggard face. Stevens seemed like a little child. To Duane the moment was sad, elemental, big, with a burden of mystery he could not understand. Duane buried him in a shallow arroyo, and heaped up a pile of stones to mark the grave. That done, he saddled his comrade's horse, hung the weapons over the pommel, and, mounting his own steed, he rode down the trail in the gathering twilight. End of chapter. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Lone Star Ranger by Zane Grey, Chapter 4. 2 days later, about the middle of the forenoon, Duane dragged the two horses up the last ascent of an exceedingly rough trail and found himself on top of the rim rock, with a beautiful green valley at his feet, the yellow, sluggish Rio Grande shining in the sun, and the great, wild, mountainous barren of Mexico stretching to the south. Duane had not fallen in with any travelers. He had taken the likeliest-looking trail he had come across. Where it had led him he had not the slightest idea, except that here was the river, and probably the enclosed valley was the retreat of some famous outlaw. No wonder outlaws were safe in that wild refuge. Duane had spent the last 2 days climbing the roughest and most difficult trail he had ever seen. From the looks of the descent, he imagined the worst part of his travel was yet to come. Not improbably, it was 2,000 feet down to the river. The wedge-shaped valley, green with alfalfa and cottonwood, and nestling down amid the bare walls of yellow rock, was a delight and a relief to his tired eyes. Eager to get down to a level and to find a place to rest, Duane began the descent. The trail proved to be the kind that could not be descended slowly. He kept dodging rocks which his horses loosed behind him, and in a short time he reached the valley, entering at the apex of the wedge. A stream of clear water tumbled out of the rocks here, and most of it ran into irrigation ditches. His horses drank thirstily. and he drank with that fullness and gratefulness common to the desert traveler finding sweet water. Then he mounted and rode down the valley, wondering what would be his reception. The valley was much larger than it had appeared from the high elevation. Well watered, green with grass and tree, and farmed evidently by good hands, it gave Duane a considerable surprise. Horses and cattle were everywhere. Every clump of cottonwoods surrounded a small adobe house. Duane saw Mexicans working in the fields and horsemen going to and fro. Presently he passed a house bigger than the others, with a porch attached. A woman, young and pretty, he thought, watched him from a door. No one else appeared to notice him. Presently the trail widened into a road, and that into a kind of square lined by a number of adobe and log buildings of rudest structure. Within sight were horses, dogs, a couple of steers, Mexican women with children, and white men, all of whom appeared to be doing nothing. His advent created no interest until he rode up to the white men, who were lolling in the shade of a house. This place evidently was a store and saloon, and from the inside came a lazy hum of voices. As Duane reined to a halt, one of the loungers in the shade rose with a loud exclamation. "Bust me if that ain't Luke's hoss!" The others accorded their interest, if not assent, by rising to advance toward Duane. "How about it, Euchre? Ain't that Luke's bay?" queried the first man. "Plain as your nose," replied the fellow named Euchre. "There ain't no doubt about it, then," laughed another, "for Bosomer's nose is sure plain on the landscape." These men lined up before Duane, and as he coolly regarded them he thought they could have been recognized anywhere as desperadoes. The man called Bosomer, who had stepped forward, had a forbidding face which showed yellow eyes, an enormous nose, and a skin the color of dust, with a thatch of sandy hair. "Stranger, who are you and where in the hell did you get that bay hoss?" he demanded. His yellow eyes took in Stevens's horse, then the weapons hung on the saddle, and finally turned their glinting, hard light upward to Duane. Duane did not like the tone in which he had been addressed, and he remained silent. At least half his mind seemed busy with curious interest in regard to something that leaped inside him and made his breast feel tight. He recognized it as that strange emotion which had shot through him often of late, and which had decided him to go out to the meeting with Bain. Only now it was different, more powerful. "Stranger, who are you?" asked another man, somewhat more civilly. "My name's Duane," replied Duane curtly. "And how'd you come by the hoss?" Duane answered briefly, and his words were followed by a short silence, during which the men looked at him. Bosomer began to twist the ends of his beard. "Reckon he's dead all right, and nobody'd have his horse and guns," presently said Euchre. "Mr. Duane," began Bosomer in low, stinging tones, "I happen to be Luke Stevens's side partner." Duane looked him over, from dusty, worn-out boots to his slouchy sombrero. That look seemed to inflame Bosomer. "And I want the horses and them guns," he shouted. "You or anybody else can have them for all I care. I just fetched them in. But the pack is mine," replied Duane. "And say, I befriended your pard. If you can't use a civil tongue, you better cinch it." "Civil? Haw haw!" rejoined the outlaw. "I don't know you. How do we know you didn't plug Stevens, stole his hoss, and just happened to stumble down here?" "You'll have to take my word, that's all," replied Duane sharply. "I ain't taking your word. Savvy that? And I was Luke's pard." With that Bosomer wheeled, and pushing his companions aside, he stamped into the saloon, where his voice broke out in a roar. Duane dismounted and threw his bridle. "Stranger, Bosomer is sure hot-headed," said the man Euchre. He did not appear unfriendly, nor were the others hostile. At this juncture several more outlaws crowded out of the door, and the one in the lead was a tall man of stalwart physique. His manner proclaimed him a leader. He had a long face, a flaming red beard, and clear, cold blue eyes that fixed in close scrutiny upon Duane. He was not a Texan. In truth, Duane did not recognize one of these outlaws as native to his state. "I'm Bland," said the tall man authoritatively. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" Duane looked at Bland as he had at the others. This outlaw chief appeared to be reasonable, if he was not courteous. Duane told his story again, this time a little more in detail. "I believe you," replied Bland at once. "Think I know when a fellow is lying." "I reckon you're on the right trail," put in Euchre. "That about Luke wantin' his boots took off, that satisfies me. Luke had a mortal dread of dying with his boots on." At this sally the chief and his men laughed. "You said Duane. Buck Duane?" queried Bland. "Are you a son of that Duane who was a gunfighter some years back?" "Yes," replied Duane. "Never met him. Glad I didn't," said Bland with a grim humor. "So you got in trouble and had to go on the dodge? What kind of trouble?" "Had a fight." "Fight? You mean gunplay?" questioned Bland. He seemed eager, curious, speculative. "Yes, it ended in gunplay, I'm sorry to say," answered Duane. "Guess I needn't ask the son of Duane if he killed his man," went on Bland ironically. "Well, I'm sorry you bucked against trouble in my camp, but as it is, I guess you'd be wise to make yourself scarce." "Do you mean I'm politely told to move on?" asked Duane quietly. "Not exactly that," said Bland as if irritated. "If this isn't a free place, there isn't one on earth. Every man is equal here. Do you want to join my band?" "No, I don't." "Well, even if you did, I imagine that wouldn't stop Bosomer. He's an ugly fellow. He's one of the few gunmen I've met who wants to kill somebody all the time. Most men like that are four flushes. But Bosomer's all one color, and that's red. Merely for your own sake, I advise you to hit the trail." "Thanks. But if that's all, I'll stay," returned Duane. Even as he spoke, he felt that he did not know himself. Bosomer appeared at the door, pushing men who tried to detain him, and as he jumped clear of a last-reaching hand he uttered a snarl like an angry dog. Manifestly the short while he had spent inside the saloon had been devoted to drinking and talking himself into a frenzy. Bland and the other outlaws quickly moved aside, letting Duane stand alone. When Bosomer saw Duane standing motionless and watchful, a strange change passed quickly in him. He halted in his tracks, and as he did that the men who had followed him out piled over one another in their hurry to get to one side. Duane saw all the swift action, felt intuitively the meaning of it, and in Bosomer's sudden change of front. The outlaw was keen, and he had expected a shrinking, or at least a frightened antagonist. Duane knew he was neither. He felt like iron, and yet thrill after thrill ran through him. It was almost as if this situation had been one long familiar to him. Somehow he understood this yellow-eyed Bosomer. The outlaw had come out to kill him, and now, though somewhat checked by the stand of a stranger, he still meant to kill. Like so many desperadoes of his ilk, he was victim of a passion to kill for the sake of killing. Duane divined that no sudden animosity was driving Bosomer. It was just his chance. In that moment murder would have been joy to him. Very likely he had forgotten his pretext for a quarrel. Very probably his faculties were absorbed in conjecture as to Duane's possibilities. But he did not speak a word. He remained motionless for a long moment, his eyes pale and steady, his right hand like a claw. That instant gave Duane a power to read in his enemy's eyes the thought that preceded action. But Duane did not want to kill another man, Still, he would have to fight, and he decided to cripple Bosomer. When Bosomer's hand moved, Duane's gun was spouting fire. 2 shots only, both from Duane's gun, and the outlaw fell with his right arm shattered. Bosomer cursed harshly and floundered in the dust, trying to reach the gun with his left hand. His comrades, however, seeing that Duane would not kill unless forced, closed in upon Bosomer and prevented any further madness on his part. End of chapter.